So 10% of your human biochemistry is dependent on this one thing. And so everything falls apart when it's not right. This is the most current version of how we interpret the genome. That's the most actionable, but it's the least that you hear of, because even most geneticists don't even know you can think about genetics this way. So I was able to reverse and like anti-age myself from the inside.
Kashif, when it comes to our genetics, how much control do they have over us?
Wow. Okay, we're dropping a bomb right in the beginning. uh, so your genetics are your innate capacity, meaning uh, genes instruct your cells on the jobs that they do. And so you can start to understand how well you do all these various jobs. By understanding which job's not going so well, you may understand what you may be at risk of. So to answer your question, that has to be combined with the wrong inputs, environment, nutrition, lifestyle, to equal a problem. Because for the most part, we're not born with problems. We're not born with sleep issues and cardiovascular disease and breast cancer, etc. So all we're saying is that with the innate genetic map complete, you now know what the priority is, what to focus on, what job your body's not doing so well, and therefore what are those right and wrong choices. It's a combination of both that equals something, not just the genes on its own.
All right, to take that a little bit further, we have our DNA where our genes are found, and
Mhm.
this doesn't change over a lifetime. So we can get tested once, find out what our genes are, and that's what we're working with. And what you're getting at here is the fact that where lifestyle comes into play is that interaction with our environment, with our lifestyle, with the genes is going to create the overall expression of those genes.
There's some stuff that is constant and instantaneous that is truly expression, meaning move from one room to another, one stress level to another stress level. And there's dials that turn where your genes will express at different levels. So you have a, 6 out of 10 version of the gene, and it starts to operate on an 8 out of 10. It starts to work a little harder. So that's the constant that's happening every day. Then there's the more longitudinal. Here's a big gaping red hole in my genome. For example, I may have the worst quality arterial hardware. Genetically, I was just born with bad quality hardware. So now that may be longitudinal, where over time, the inflammation that can so easily set in because I have bad, lining or whatever the material is that we're looking at. So there's two considerations: the constant, like you said, the genetic expression every day, where you can literally feel different every day, and then there's the long-term outcome where we can prevent something so disastrous from happening.
So when it comes to these factors, environmental, diet, different things we're going to get into, is it the fact that these are what affect our genes in a negative way? And then depending on what our predisposition is because of our own individual genetics, that's going to be what breaks when it comes to inflammation or things going awry because of the environment.
Yeah, so I think there's genetics, then there's functional genomics. So two different applications. Genetics is exactly what you just said. Genetics is, here's a version of a gene, here's expression that may happen that may lead to some propensity, an 80% chance of this, not feeling so good on some day, which really is points to pharmaceutical answers, right? Let's try and turn things on and off is really what the world's looking for. Functional genomics is, I can understand today, regardless of how you're expressing, regardless of what you're doing, what jobs your body's doing well or not so well. So I now know exactly what to prescribe in terms of environment, nutrition, and lifestyle. So one is more reactionary. One is more, I'm constantly responding to what's going on. One is I can actually be proactive and build a plan. It's more functional. I now know for me what the right choices are. I now know for me what I should cut out, what I need to add. So this is the most current version of how we interpret the genome. That's the most actionable, but it's the least that you hear of, because even most geneticists don't even know you can think about genetics this way, right?
And where this becomes really interesting, you talked about pharmaceutical there quickly. The fact that a lot of us that are even more advanced within the natural health and wellness space, we might be taking a certain core number of supplements on a daily basis, and that core package would likely be the same or very similar from person to person who is looking to be preventative and to optimize their health and wellness. So, what we're doing is almost just shooting blanks out there and hoping that we hit the right things, even when it comes to supplements, rather than doing the genetic testing, find out where we need to be supported, and then supplementing in those specific areas.
Exactly. And so there's supplements can be done in terms of masking a problem. Like I can't sleep, I have headaches, I don't have enough energy. So you go find the thing that is purported to support that. Or you could look at the system failure that made you feel that way, right? I have pain or I don't have energy, for example. I don't have energy. So I'm going to go take a supplement that's reported and marketed as giving me energy. And I might feel better. But did I actually solve the root problem of why my energy level is low to begin with? Is my mitochondria actually functioning properly? So the mitochondria is that powerhouse in the cell that takes in oxygen and nutrition to create energy. So if that's the problem, where genetically we can determine that you don't deal with oxidation well or mitochondrial function well, if you resolve the root, you not only resolve that energy problem, but you resolve all these other spokes that came out of it that you maybe didn't even know were there. All of a sudden, there's a little bit of weight lifted off your shoulder. The mind's a little sharper. You're sleeping a little bit less because the quality of sleep is better. So you could either end up with a basket of supplements to mask things or target the core. And then going back to what you said, even in that basket, you need to be a lot more specific. Um, if you're taking, your B vitamins, your D vitamins, daily stuff that people take, the genes that actually metabolize those micronutrients are known. So if I go pull a methylcobalamin B12 off the CVS shelf and start taking it, thinking that I'm helping with my inflammation, and my methylation pathway, well, what if my ancestors didn't eat beef? They actually don't metabolize B12 in their stomach. They actually metabolize it right in their mouth. So I need a very different version that's called a sublingual, under the tongue. What if my ancestors gave me a different version of the MTR or MTRR gene? Then I don't actually use methylcobalamin, that standard that you buy in the store. Well, I need a different version called adenosine. That's what my body's calling for because that's what the diet of my ancestors included. So you can get very, very prescriptive and specific, both on the sort of symptom masking level, making that cornucopia of stuff more efficient, but also on the root cause level. What should I actually be taking?
And if we were to take that B12 example, it seems like there'd be two different ways to approach this. What you just said being a lot more efficient, where you're testing the genetics and knowing exactly, the form you need and how you take it. But also, up until this point, before we had genetics, the other way around is to get your B12 tested
Mm-hmm.
and then see what the form you're using, if that's bringing it up to the optimal range.
Yeah,
So for people who might be in a situation, we're going to get into genetic testing, and there is a certain price tag with that some people may not be able to afford or have access to. And there still is that other way around about getting your testing done overall and then looking back at what you've been doing and seeing how things are integrating,
sure.
although not as efficient.
Sure. Yeah, it's a little more trial and error, a little more sort of one size fits all, and then working through it, or being precise on day one. There's some areas where that works, where I can test. I can go take B12. I can go test. I see numbers resolving themselves. Okay, I landed on the right choice. There's some areas where the testing doesn't actually inform what's happening in the body. So, for example, vitamin D. You can go get a vitamin D test and you'll be told that your normal levels are good, your whatever you're doing is right, keep doing what you're doing. The metabolic pathway for vitamin D is much more complex than other micronutrients because you can overdose. It can be damaging, it can be toxic if you have too much, but you also need to be at that balanced optimal amount to feel great, right? So, step one, there's a gene that takes D2 out of the sun, converts it into D3, puts it into the blood. So that's one step. Then there's a gene that transports it to the cell, gets it to where you need it to be. Then there's a gene that binds it at the cell and actually gets it utilized. No other micronutrient has this level of complexity. So now if I go test how much is in the blood, I still don't know how efficiently I'm transporting it and how well I'm binding it. So there's a lot of people walking around being told that they have the great level, the right level, but because of their ancestry, whether they were more equatorial or Mediterranean, or they had heavy exposure to sun, or maybe they were agricultural, even if they were northern, maybe they were in the sun a lot because they were agricultural. So then they developed this genetic ability to mitigate using what was in the blood. And so that number isn't enough. It needs to be personalized. And, seasonal mood disorder, bone issues, mood issues, female cycle issues, 22,000 genes in your body, 2,000 express properly only if you have the right amount of vitamin D. So 10% of your human biochemistry is dependent on this one thing. And so everything falls apart when it's not right. And that's where you need to really personalize.
I'm so happy we're getting into the vitamin D, and I want to take some time and really delve in here
Sure.
because it's very nuanced. And for people that feel like they have control over their vitamin D, say they're supplementing or getting enough sun on a regular basis, you've broken this down into the 3 different genes that you need to have working in proper order to get the vitamin D where it needs to be to do its job. But right away, there might be people that say they're even supplementing, maybe they're not getting that optimal dose.
Mm-hmm.
So right away you could be supplementing, but you're getting maybe just what the recommended dose is versus what the optimal dose is.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, a lot of people aren't even testing. And if they are testing, they're just testing that first step, making sure that they're actually getting it into the blood. And then number 3, I'm throwing a lot out here, but number 3 is we don't even know everything that's in sun. Like we're assuming vitamin D3, well, D2 that's converted to D3 is the benefit we're getting from the sun, or a lot of people assume that. But there may be, and likely there is, a whole array of different benefits from going to the source.
Yeah.
But again, that being said, we'll caveat the fact that when we're in a northern climate like we are, we have to do the best we can. And at this point with where science is, we know that D3, supplementing with it, is beneficial. So a long rant there, but I'll have you share your thoughts on what I just said.
Yeah, for sure. So, plants live off photosynthesis. So we know there's a lot more going on in sunlight than just vitamin D. There's a level of nutrition that we're getting that we don't understand yet. Even, for example, just the fact that vitamin D comes sort of through the sun. This is like fairly modern science. Up until the 1930s, I believe, vitamin D was called vitamin A. They didn't even realize it was 2 different things, right? And it was only in the 1970s that the research really went into what we're taking from the sun, how it all works, and what the body's doing with it all, and understanding what it drives. So, yes, if you get up and get out in the sun, and that's the first thing you do, if you have access, first of all, it's going to change the way you feel the rest of the day, right? Your circadian rhythm starts. That's what our ancestors did. They got out and they worked outside, right? Circadian rhythm kicks in. The clock is working efficiently. Metabolic pathways start firing. Hormones get regulated because they're aligned with that clock and circadian rhythm. So everything sort of balances out and you feel better mentally, physically. Vitamin D3 is sort of the second best thing we can do to trigger the net outcome of that sunlight. Right now, the body can say, okay, well, I just got this heavy load of vitamin D. It's daytime, it's morning time. And that's what I do. It's winter in Toronto right now. So I'm taking 10,000 IU in the morning and another 10,000 IU sort of midday. My vitamin D pathways are horrible, and that's why I split it. So if I go take the 20,000 that I think I need when I'm sick, which, by the way, 2 weeks ago, I had to travel and I caught this flu. And I took my 20,000 for that purpose to get all the systems firing. I didn't take it all in the morning. I split the dose because my transport is not efficient. My binding is not efficient. So if I go take that 20, I may only use 5 of it. But if I split the dose, I'll get what I need. It also signals to the circadian rhythm and clock, those 2 heavy doses, that it's still like daytime. It's still, and it pushes the clock along, right? So, so yes, for sure, you cannot replace sunlight. We don't even yet know all of what we're getting from sunlight. But those of us that are in jurisdictions where we have limited options, you need definitely. Why is there so much seasonal mood disorder in the winter? We blame it on the Christmas season and the holidays, but it's because you don't have vitamin D. You're in the clouds in the dark for so long. You're just not getting the micronutrient you need, and then the brain and neurochemicals aren't firing properly, and you start to feel off. And D3 is the active form, the metabolized form, which is really what you should be taking: a liquid D3 with the vitamin K. And ideally either some fat or magnesium to help you absorb it better, either one. And so some people are concerned with their fasting, and a lot of people are, not eating their first meal until 1 or 2 o'clock now. If you have a spoonful of olive oil or a little bit of yogurt, it's not enough calories to break a fast. Your body's going to keep pushing through. And fat, usually on its own, There's research around you can actually take like a fat bomb, like a bowl of peanut butter, and your body will still keep fasting. Protein, sugar, carbs will immediately break a fast, but a fat bomb won't. The benefit will continue. So anyways, just that little tidbit there. Get it if you're getting it in the morning. Make sure there's some magnesium, there's some fat. Make sure there's some K2 if you're taking high doses, because there's the byproduct of calcification and other problems. So you want to get the K2. But if you juggle all that properly, yeah, you can take your heavy dose and feel amazing.
You mentioned there quickly the fact that if we take a fat bomb in, it's not going to break the fast. I've heard you talk about, though, and this is a specific population, that there are certain people genetically who, when they take in fat, they will have an insulin response.
Yeah.
So, can you talk about what that gene is and how that works?
So TCF7L2 is the insulin regulating gene. So some people are insulin resistant, right? And they're going to have a harder time struggling with carbs, sugars. The AMY1 gene determines how efficiently you convert starch into glucose to use as fuel to begin with. So is this the right thing for you? Do you use this as a proper fuel? A lot of us don't, which we obviously now know. Uh, the second layer to that is your insulin response, and if that's also dysregulated, you're the person that had the bowl of pasta and needs to go take a nap after. The body's struggling. The interesting thing is we found in South Asian populations, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Afghani, that whole region, will get a similar insulin response trigger from saturated fats as Western Europeans do from carbs and sugar. It's also from the carbs and sugar, but the studied research, remember, most medical research is on Western European males. So all of what the whole world is relying on is based on current sort of pharmaceutical based medicine is on that population. Not even Eastern European males, but Western European white males. That's where all the research is. And so we think we're all the same. We're not. Um, Another example with the Asian, so Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, that whole region, uh, there's genes around hypertension. And what is considered the optimal result based on published science, which is research on Western European white males, is the opposite for Asians. So they keep getting told you're doing great. Well, then why do I have this hypertension issue? Right? Why do I have this poor response? It's literally the opposite. So there are some nuances there, and this is why we did what we did. We realized that the gap that was sort of the limiting factor for genetic interpretation is that the interpreters and the researchers weren't meeting patients. They weren't applying the stuff. And so we took all of what was already known genetically, and we spent 3 years studying 7,000 people. So one by one, genetic consults, deep dive, spending months working on their hormones, working on their diet, trying to understand their detox pathways and why they were sick. And we learned all of these little nuances I'm talking about that can only be understood if you actually interact with people. To what did you eat? What is your environment? What kind of mattress are you sleeping on? What do you use in your garden, in your lawn? What kind of pesticides? And then those little pearls were applied into sort of our knowledge base, and now we can be a lot more actionable.
And when it comes to different people responding, we gave the example there of responding, having an insulin response when somebody takes in fat. You mentioned the person who has a pasta dinner and then they pass out.
Yeah.
Is this where using genetics to see different diets, I'm assuming this must be, how we can use that to see if a ketogenic diet, say, or a vegan diet is more appropriate depending on the person?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. So I can't tell you how many people we've dealt with at the clinical level where we identified that the day they started feeling bad was the day they became vegan. And I'm not saying nobody can be a vegan. It's probably not the easiest thing to be for most people, but there's certain genes that produce the enzymes to break down your beans, lentils, legumes, chickpeas. Where do vegans get their protein from? Right? And even myself, I would switch once in a while, just thinking maybe it's beneficial to a pea protein shake and then a whey protein shake. And, sometimes I would take a casein overnight. It's like a slow drip. And the pea protein would always bloat me. I thought that it was so efficient in satiety, but it was actually bloating. I didn't realize that's why I wasn't hungry on time for my next meal. So there's genes around producing those enzymes to help you break those things down. And most of us don't do that so well. And when you go out there and become a vegan, it's not only going to mess with that, then the hormones get dysregulated. We see a lot of men who start to lose muscle mass, and they're thinking I'm getting my protein, but the amino acid profile is not the same. And the genetics that call for something, that are expecting something, that are getting something else, are not doing the job properly. And all of a sudden you lose muscle mass, you don't feel well. So same thing with the keto diet. There's a very famous sort of advocate of the keto diet that we had to tell them the reason that they don't have good cardiovascular health is because they're on keto. Everybody feels great in the first month. You get into ketosis, the ketones are firing, your brain feels amazing, you're burning fat for fuel, you can look down and the belly shrinking. It's about 5-6 weeks into it, the ApoA2 gene, if you're not a good metabolizer of fat, you're going to start to feel sluggish, lethargic, a little bit of brain fog, and it gets worse and worse and worse over time. So something like that, it's good to cycle in and out of. Even if you're not a good fat metabolizer, you'll still get the benefit of getting into ketosis, burning some fat, but you can't stay on it. So all we're saying is that you can now personalize and know exactly what to do.
You mentioned there the fact that for a number of weeks, if somebody goes on a keto diet, even if they don't have the right genetics, they're going to feel good, making that switch and starting to burn fat. Also, with a vegan diet, if somebody's coming from a standard American diet to a clean, say organic, local as possible vegan diet, they have to realize that they might feel good for a period of time as well. But with both of these and any diet that's not compatible with the person's genetics, the genetics will eventually catch up with the person.
That's true of everything. Somebody jumping on the treadmill, somebody, whatever that choice is, when you start doing anything versus what you were doing before, adding a layer of work, you feel better, right? It's ultimately most likely cleaner than whatever you were doing. So you cannot help but feeling good the first few weeks as a vegan. You feel so light. You feel like you mentally feel better. There's the guilt is gone, right? You feel empowered. There's a sense of reward from the dopamine hit of like I'm achieving something. It starts to feel good, right? The metabolic dysfunction that happens and kicks in takes time. But certainly, there's certain people where we have to tell them that the reason that they have cardiovascular disease is because they spend too much time doing cardiovascular exercise. Completely counterintuitive. And the first few weeks, anybody jumps on a treadmill, they're not going to like it, but they're going to feel great. They're going to feel mentally empowered. They're going to feel like they're burning fat. They're going to enjoy the sweat, the post-workout feeling, that achievement. Well, we talked about the mitochondria earlier on. The way we clear oxidation. So when you're taking in oxygen to create energy through the mitochondria, there's always an oxidant, which is the byproduct. It's a free radical, a toxin. And we don't all, at the same level of efficiency, clear this oxidation from the cell. And some of us end up choking and suffocating the cell with this oxidation and aging ourselves, truly aging ourselves. So if that's you, which a lot of us, that is the case, and you're on a treadmill 4 or 5 days a week, and you're pushing your oxidative stress load to a new threshold that you were never designed for, then you're going to cause inflammation. Because what's happening with all these free radicals floating around in your bloodstream that maybe you also don't have the genetic ability to detoxify? There's another layer. We then look at your detox pathways. Okay, you're pumping all this stuff out into the blood. How well do you get rid of it? Maybe you're not doing that well. Then maybe we go back to one of the very first things we said. What does your hardware look like? If you don't have the best quality arterial hardware, and I point that out because the number one disease we face is cardiovascular. The number one killer today is cardiovascular disease. It's something that's like 1 in 2, 50% of Americans are expected to have. So that's why I bring that up. The inner lining of the blood vessel is called the endothelium, right? It's a one cell membrane, which is what the blood actually flows through and touches. The quality of that can be determined genetically. How robust is that lining? So if you have the bad ability to deal with oxidation and you have the bad detox pathways, you're not getting rid of all the stuff they just pumped out into the blood, and you have bad hardware, well, we know you're going to get inflammation now because there's something to cause this bad quality hardware damage. And the body's response to that is to use cholesterol as a hormone to reduce the inflammation. And when the cholesterol meets oxidation, it itself oxidizes and hardens. It gets deposited and can't move anymore. And then you get that buildup. So the root cause of this was somebody being a marathon runner or being a a treadmill junkie or whatever it is, that could have been the one activity, given all the other things that maybe were going on, that may be the thing that pushed them over the threshold. And it's completely counterintuitive, but at a personalized level for somebody, that might actually be the answer.
And as you say that, what jumps out at me is the fact that we've been talking mostly about these different areas and silos, whether it be, supplementation, exercise. But then for somebody that doesn't have that genetic map and they're, trying to piece all this together over a period of time by experimenting and trying different diets, different types of exercise, and seeing what works for them, you have all the variables overlapping. So, maybe you're getting the diet right, but you're doing the wrong kind of exercise.
Right.
And then that's throwing off everything in your body.
Yeah.
So without that map and taking that full zoomed out view of everything and understanding how all this fits together, I can imagine that overlap would cause people a lot of confusion trying to sift through what's best for them in all the different areas.
Yeah. If you don't know what's broken, how do you fix it? You're taking everybody's advice, and rightfully so. Whatever they're talking about probably worked for them. If you log onto some podcast like this and hear someone say something great, it probably made them feel better. That's them, right? They're not you. So, and even within a family, you'll see differences. Like, look at my family, for example. Um, I have one son, the middle child of three, who just wouldn't do his homework. Drama queen, right? Literally on the floor, screaming, kicking his legs, whatever. And the initial reaction is discipline, attitude. He doesn't care, right? That's what you would say about a kid that just won't do it. And then I realized, hold on, I have his genome in hand. Let me figure out what's going on here. So I started by looking at the neurochemicals and understanding how his brain is mapped, and we can dive deep into that. And I didn't really see a major problem there other than his serotonin was dysregulated. So he's a little bit irritable. It's very easy to poke at him and get him bothered. Um, then I just said, let me just look for red flags. What do I see? And what I saw was the exact combination I was talking about earlier. He has the worst starch metabolic pathway, and he has the worst possible insulin response, right? So now you take that back and apply it to the context of homework happened right after dinner in a South Asian home where we ate rice almost every day. And if it wasn't rice, it was pasta, you know, and this kid was having an extreme carb crash, brain dead, truly being told to go do some work. Couldn't function for that next hour, which is the exact hour that his work was scheduled. And so there was a timing change, there was a diet change, and all of a sudden, and there was also some supplementation, 5-HTP to regulate his serotonin so that he wasn't so annoyed about things. And all of a sudden, this guy's thriving, right? So how many layers would we have picked at that were not your typical places to go when it comes to homework and, behavior problems, before getting to the one root that was the actual problem? We could have spent years on it and been told that he has ADHD and he needs to take medication and he has an attitude problem and he needs counseling, and who knows where it would have gone, right? But it was just this one thing that needed to be sort of adjusted.
And as you're saying this, what comes to my mind is how this seems like such a thing of, science and improving health and wellness, which part of that, so it does tie together, is relationships. So I can see how, if you didn't have this information and you're able to make these changes, how you could be bumping heads for a number of years or a lifetime and cause friction in that relationship. And to expand upon that further, I see this being a really powerful tool amongst couples.
Oh, yeah.
And being able to understand their partner and the nuances within that relationship. And then even when it comes to one example like dinner, maybe there's just certain nuances to that meal that each you need to embrace to feel your best and to fuel a healthy relationship together.
Yeah. There hasn't been a family that we work with where it didn't turn into a counseling session, because unintentionally usually. But when people start to hear how well we understand their mental map. So the neurochemicals that drive behavior are already known. We already know what dopamine does, what serotonin does, what brain-derived neurotropic factor does, et cetera, et cetera. What wasn't known was what genes drive those pathways, and not sort of chemical by chemical, but the true pathway. Meaning, when you feel something, suppose there's some tasty pizza, right? That's dopamine. I'm going to get pleasure. It's not just dopamine. It's dopamine is deployed. Dopamine is bound. There's the actual experience. So first there's the anticipation. It's coming, it's coming. Then there's a moment, it's happening. Then there's the metabolization. I need to get rid of that dopamine to come back to normal. And then there's the clearance. Let's get rid of the metabolite. So if you don't understand the nuances of all four steps, you can't really be certain about what that means for somebody, because this same pathway could equal addict, it could equal depressed, it could equal anxiety, it could equal entrepreneurial and warrior type mentality, depending on how you turn these four dials, right? So um, that always reflects itself and comes out in sort of family sessions, because people have this aha moment of, oh, that's why I feel the way I feel. I actually see the world differently than you. And when you say not this again, that actually is real to you. And to me, it's not. And then there's another example, adr2b, noradrenaline response. So your adrenaline response that happens during anything impactful causes you to either ignore or imprint trauma, pain, negative stimulus. And there's some people that are deleted for a certain section of this gene. So it's not the whole gene, but just a piece of it. There's a part of the code that gets broken, that are much more likely to imprint trauma. What that means is the next time something similar happens, not only do they remember the intellectual component, but the feeling comes back. It literally comes right back as if they just came off of that last thing that could have been years ago, months ago, days ago. And so the other spouse says, not this again, right? Like you're doing it again. And they're like, what do you mean doing it again? You did this to me. They're like, no, you're relating this to that has nothing to do with this, right? And those kind of conversations happen because the two people are seeing it entirely differently. And do that year after year after year after year. Where does that lead to? So now understanding that, what ends up happening is truly beautiful. The partners now identify each other's superpowers. That same thing that makes you feel trauma, pain, hold the grudge, bring your pain back, is also your empathy. It's also your emotional intelligence, your EQ. And if the partners understand that this is what this person is wired for, use it to your advantage. Lean on their emotional intelligence. Use their intuition. Let them read the room and understand what people are feeling. And you take a step back and be the logical person. And we see these couples all of a sudden become super powerful in terms of their ability to work together, and it becomes so much more functional.
What you just said there is so important, where we could get our genetic makeup done, look at the details, and then look at it when there's things that we maybe wouldn't have chosen if we could pick our genetics. We might look at that as broken. But what you're saying is there's a little bit of a spin on that, where we look at it as our superpower. We just need to know how to tame that.
Yeah.
So I think just having that little bit of a tweak for somebody that gets in there and looks at this can be so much more empowering.
Yeah, I believe that from our experience dealing with people, all of the labels of anxiety, depression, addiction, procrastination, burnout, these things are superpowers that are being masked in the wrong context. And I'm not talking about the clinical, somebody that needs to go to the hospital. That's an issue. That's a chemical imbalance. A person has a condition per se, right? The majority, however, the majority of what we're dealing with, chronic mood issues, mood disorders, is not that. You weren't born with your depression. You weren't born with, for the majority of us, right? So what we see is happening, and go back to the dopamine pathway. If you do experience dopamine at a very low level, so it's very hard for you to experience that pleasure. And if you do clear it a little bit faster and it doesn't last long enough, then depression is a very easy place to be, because the world sucks, right? Whatever your friends are saying about how great stuff is, you just can't feel it. And while it's happening, it's so fast that you can't hold on to it long enough. You need more, and you need more, and more, you need more. So in a different context where that person is provided pleasure, they can become an addict, because it's so much easier for them to chase and pursue that feeling, because it's so hard to hold on to and get. So they need another hit and another hit and another hit. That same person in a different context, where suppose they're struggling and need to work and take care of the family, can be highly entrepreneurial and achievement oriented, because dopamine not only powers pleasure, but it also powers reward, the reward of doing something great. So ultimately satisfaction. Both of these things are satisfaction. And so based on the context, I'm with my friends in a normal life, so I'm just doing normal stuff. I'm constantly depressed. I'm doing this thing that gives me a sense of pleasure that I found. I'm going to become an addict. I need to struggle and work, and I'm a warrior because everyone's relying on me. I'm going to become an entrepreneur, and I'm neither depressed or addicted, right? Because your body's only calling for one of these. So the context, this is where we are able to unravel people's anxiety, people's addiction, people's depression issues, and show them how that thing that's a burden currently is actually their superpower. They were wired to do something great. They're just in the wrong context, and they need to make that shift over and over and over and again. We see people's lives just turn around.
So we've talked about a number of different shifts people can take when you know the genetics. You just said like shifting context. So if you're, maybe in a different field of work that fits your genetics better. And when you talked about your son, you mentioned taking a supplement, 5-HTP, or I think for him it was modifying some of the macronutrients he was taking in within his dinner, maybe moving his homework back so it's not right after the meal. What I'm getting at here is when we know the genetics, what are some of these other levers we can pull? And obviously, this is going to be individual depending on what the person has genetically. But what are some of the other tweaks and adjustments you make to diet, lifestyle, supplements? We'll stick in the mental health realm right now for these different challenges people are having.
Yeah, so there's two big dials that apply to everything. So what are we saying? Genetically, we can either identify how well or how poorly you do a job. So there's something in your body that you're actually doing, well, three, not well, just right, or a little bit too much, right? It's kind of one of those three. And so now we know what you need to do about it. Too much might be a bad thing if it's a certain job, or it could be a really good thing, like in detoxification, for example. So there's two dials you can turn. I know I don't do this job well, which means, and if we use detoxification as an example, I need to avoid chemicals, pesticides. I need an organic mattress because I sleep on it for 8 hours, breathing in whatever chemicals are on it. I need to understand where I get my dry cleaning done. That's one dial. The second dial is, so one dial is you don't do the job, so avoid the things that are the job supposed to do for you. Second dial is I still need to do these things. I work in a factory. I play sports on a field, so I'm still going to be exposed. Then I need to supplement with the right things that alter the gene expression to allow me to do the job better. Ideally, you're turning both of these dials. And this is true for everything. You name any sort of innate genetic red flag in your genome, these are the two dials you should be turning for everything. Avoid the problem, know what the right choices are for you, and then add more of the correct choices, and then supplement to make up for the thing you don't do well. Because the reality is, our world is not our ancestors' world. So, as much as you try to avoid, you're still exposed, right? So, you got to do both of these things.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you touched on this quickly, the fact that in an ideal world, we could use the people that are more genetically susceptible to these environmental toxins, that one dial, as the canaries in the coal mine.
Yeah.
For people that aren't, to, you mentioned organic mattress and avoiding dry cleaning. These are things ideally we're doing to build a resilient system no matter where we are genetically, so we can hopefully extend our life and live a healthier life.
Yeah. I mean, the canary in the coal mine is happening all around us. Um, take an example like autism, where, within this last century, like 2 generations ago, it was 1 in 10,000 kids was autistic. Then a generation ago, it was 1 in 500. And now it's, I think, one in the high 20s, like 28, right? It's a little bit less for girls. I think for girls, it's like 1 in 50, but for boys, it's 1 in 28. So the kids didn't change in that time. The genes are the same, genetics are the same. What changed is the environment, the nutrition, the chemical exposures, the EMF, the electronic pollution, right? This is all of what changed. So we know that the canaries, unfortunately, are already signaling to us that the environment and the reality that we're in is far more than what humans were meant to tolerate. We are not wired for this reality. The chemical reality, the food reality, the electronic reality, the pharma medical reality, the reactionary response to health as opposed to the proactive, planned out wellness. So, and we're seeing it with children, we're seeing it with women, and how many more female hormone issues there are. This is probably the number one sort of gray area that needs fixing. which is the answer today is you're supposed to have problems. It's your hormones. You're a woman. That's actually the answer. You're supposed to have a crazy menopause. You're supposed to have a crazy menstrual cycle. Fertility is a gray area. We don't know what's going to happen. The truth is that when you have hormone dominance, maybe more estrogen, maybe more testosterone, women can lean in different directions, and you start to apply all the hormone disruptors that are in our environment, yes, we now see all these women as the canaries. They are now showing us that their bodies are not designed to deal with the current endocrine disruptors, the plastics, the chemicals, all the things that are mimicking and mirroring and altering hormone levels. We're seeing it in chronic disease. You know, 1 in 2 Americans is expected to get a cardiovascular disease. 1 in 2 Americans is expected to get cancer. So pick one, right? That's the current reality. By the age of 55, you are expected to have a chronic disease. By the age of 65, you're expected to have two. The American projection is you spend the last 15 years of your life in treatment. So this was not true 100 years ago. People died of frailty. They died of viruses and bacteria and also hygienic issues that we don't now have today. But they didn't die in these numbers of chronic disease. So the canaries, to put in your words, are out there in many, many different ways to show us that regardless of how great your genetics are, okay, great, you're some things are maybe a little bit less of a threat and you can prioritize certain things better because there's less to deal with. Our reality is not what we're designed for. Things have gone a little too far in terms of chemicals, food, etc. So you got to be hyper diligent about all this stuff and just be a little bit more careful.
Well, to take what you're talking about there and run with that a little bit, I think the work you're doing is even more important these days than it would have been 100 years ago. Given the current environment that is toxic, that we're all going to be taking in these toxins because of the current, situation of the world, then what we need to do is go to the genetics and make sure we're doing everything we can to support those. But 100 years ago, say when the environment was more of a neutral ground, and this is hypothetical, maybe we wouldn't need to be as, concerned with the genetics, living a modest life.
That's exactly true. Why do we have the genetics we have? We inherited our ancestral genetic legacy. We inherited what our ancestors survived with. They didn't need it. They didn't need highly potent, complex detox pathways because there was no toxins to fight. Right? They didn't need to. Inflammation wasn't chronic like it is today. It was acute. It was a response to, I dropped a hammer on my foot. I got stabbed with a sword. There was acute inflammatory scenarios that you need to deal with. So our bodies are designed for that. So they deal with inflammation quite well. But when every single day there's a threat causing you potential inflammation, that's not what we're supposed to be doing, right? Same thing with our mood. The neurochemicals and what they're designed for, they're designed to make us progress, and they're designed to make us sort of achieve and move forward as a civilization. But when the dopamine hits are now scrolling on a phone, right, and are now like I have 1,000 channels and I have Disney and Netflix and like name all the streaming services I have, and I still can't find what I want to watch, right? Versus 3 channels when I was, my grandparents' era, right? That's whatever it was. So that reality, right? The mental dump, the dopamine dump that's happening. So all of these contexts, yes, our ancestors didn't live in, and we have their genetics. When I say their genetics, it goes far beyond that. Our DNA is 200,000 years old at least. It's probably more, somewhere between 2 to 300,000 years old, meaning that we are wired exactly the same genetically as people of that time. Now, our current reality, environmentally, culturally, all the stimulus, electronic, TV, all this stuff, food, etc. This is the last generation. 2 generations ago, it was getting there. It wasn't quite there yet. Versus 200,000 years of hard wiring, right? That's like taking a car and just throwing it up into space, expecting it to fly. It's not a rocket, right? We're not there yet. And it takes a long, long time to catch up with that genetically. We're nowhere near there, which is why aging is a problem, sickness is a problem, mood is a problem, all these problems exist. So if you take that one thing away, just understand that the world we're in, when you think about your ancestors, it's not mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. That's very tight in the 200,000 year timeline. Those are your ancestors. That's what you're wired for. Fast forward to today and see what that looks like versus the last 200,000 years. No wonder everything is a threat.
So, in a general sense, you're saying the genetics have been the same for at least 200,000 years. What that brings up for me is, why do we have so much variance between humans? And obviously, there's one thing that jumps out right away, the fact that a lot of us evolved in different areas of the planet with different environmental conditions and different food supply. So maybe I'm answering my own question as I go here, but why such a variance? I mean, you're the one on the other side here, and I'd like to hear your
Sure.
perspective. Looking at all the genes of I don't know how many people it's been, I assume thousands and thousands. Like, I'm assuming you're seeing such a complex array of different presentations. Why the variance?
So we started off thinking the same, that how do we really get this to people because it's so infinite in possibility, and how do you start to build products and solutions? Suppose we wanted to make supplements, for example. Do we need a million different formulas just for anxiety because there's a million different out of the 8 billion people possible iterations? And what we started to see was that, first of all, the genes that matter, there's 22,000 genes that make up your genome. There's only about 100 that we look at because those are the ones that are functional, that are actionable, that drive the major systems: hormones, brain, diet, inflammation, the big things that move the needle, right? So we brought it down to that. And of those 100 genes, there's usually maximum one, sometimes two locations on the gene that we're actually looking for something. And usually there's one of three potential outcomes. So now you have a gene, for example, dopamine binding. We brought it down to good, medium, bad. So now there's three potential outcomes for that one thing, right? So now fast forward all this stuff. Take hormones, for example. When we started, we were looking at like infinite number of possibilities. Women look like this, men look like this, etc. Then we learned that people kept fitting into these buckets. There was these like avatars of people, these profiles, and it's really one of six profiles now. So it went from infinite to like started teetering down to like people that look similar to they always fit in one of six buckets. And the middle two usually are optimal and don't need anything. So it's these outside two, which are an extreme version of the middle one, right? So it allows us to now go from exactly what you were thinking. We thought the same, and this is why it was so important to sit with those 7,000 people and take it away from what does each gene mean, the genetics, and then trying to jam that into your body, as opposed to how does the body operate and what are the genes that instruct that stuff, right? Reverse engineer it. And that got us to name a problem. There's usually 4 to 6 potential profiles for that problem.
And I would assume that naturally you're going to be working with a sicker population than the population as a whole, because, somebody's having this problem and they've been trying different solutions, maybe conventional, maybe natural, and then they Google and find, the DNA company website, and then they get their genetics done. I'm assuming this might be a last or near last resort for a lot of people that have been suffering for a long period of time.
Yeah, so
So, how do you factor that in when you're trying to extrapolate what you're looking at into the population as a whole?
that's true today, and I'm going to tell you something really cool that happened because of that. But when we first started, things were expensive, right? Because it was all manual scientists working. There was no algorithms. There was no AI that we had now built all that stuff. And so we were mostly working with executives, professional athletes, celebrities, people that could afford to pay the expensive cost of having a bunch of scientists work on your personal profile. So the first part of the work we did, which was it was around human optimization and anti-aging. How do we take this executive that already has the best doctors, this celebrity that we were literally on Hollywood sets dropping supplements into celebrities' mouths in between shots to keep them at their optimal level and learning from that, right? So that's where we started. So this human optimization, anti-aging type activity. Then we started to see that the biggest area that needed support was female hormone health. Big gray area, women were struggling. So we had a heavy focus there. And now it's exactly what you're saying, where it's now that we're out there saying we can help you, it is this population of people that have been struggling, that are gone to functional medicine, that are, they're sort of exhausted of taking pills and want a true root cause solution. And there's an interesting nuance we learned there. So in general, um, there's a gene called GSTM1, which instructs the glutathione pathway around the gut. So it protects your gut from toxic insults. And we found that in our data, 49% of people don't even have the gene. So not even what version, how good they don't have it, missing, completely missing. 46% of people are missing 50%. So either mom or dad didn't give it to them. Only 5% of people actually have the optimal 2 copies. So now you fast forward and we started to look at other data sets and our data didn't match. And so what we learn and realize is that when you're dealing with unhealthy people, the gut is so important, because over and over and over again, it was completely missing. And that was not the what were they were expressing symptomatically. They didn't have Crohn's or colitis or anything, but potentially leaky gut or potentially, downward in the digestive tract, something going on that led to the inflammatory issue somewhere else. So that's one simple example of where we're learning the true roots of all these problems.
And when it comes to somebody who is missing a section of DNA or they have the quote unquote bad gene when it comes to a certain area, why do you think humans have evolved that way? Like, nature typically doesn't make mistakes. Why are there people that are more susceptible? Is there some advantage evolutionarily to having these people part of the tribe, or what do you think?
Yeah, so it's both. It's so the way you inherit your genes, it's less evolutionary than people think. It's more like, here's my mom's genome and here's my dad's genome, and I'm getting a copy of each. And there's some blend between the two. So it's not like it's changing. It's more that I'm getting a copy from each and I don't know what I'm going to get. It's a lottery. So when you look at it population wise, there are certain populations where there wasn't a need for gut detox because food was so clean, right? And so it's more likely that there's more people that look like that still survived and did well and had good gene expression that had children, right? Then there's certain other populations where food was a threat, and those people didn't do well and didn't have children, so they didn't pass on their genetic code. Genetic expression, however, is something that we're now learning so much more is truly passed on more evolutionary, meaning that there's studies around, for example, trauma. There's a really famous study around Holocaust survivors and their grandchildren still expressing the symptomatic mood and behavior of somebody who's in trauma, because their genes are actually expressing differently. So they still inherited copy from mom, copy from dad, but the copy they got is overactive. The expression dial is turned a little too hard because that person is still as if they're reacting to that current extreme level of trauma. So that we've learned can now be inherited. That can be passed on. And that's true of any genetic expression. So when there's calamity and extreme, let's say, it's very easy to inherit genetic expression. When it comes to the baseline, you're getting a copy from mom, copy from dad. And so long as people did well with a certain problem and it didn't kill them and they were able to have kids, they passed on that profile.
I know part of your story of getting into this comes from a personal health challenge. You were actually involved in marketing, and this was a side pivot later in life for you.
Right.
So I think it'd be helpful to talk about your story at this point, what you were going through at that time when your health started to fail, and then going to the genetics, what you learned about yourself, and pivots you're able to make to take your health to the next level.
Sure. Yeah. So I was in the marketing world. What I loved doing was helping startups grow. I still enjoy it. And even with our own, we keep building new pieces of the business because that's how I think, right? Um, and so I got pretty ill. I had eczema so bad that I couldn't open my left eye, right? It was like sealed shut. I had psoriasis so bad that if I would clasp my hands like this, my knuckles would bleed. I had horrible migraines that would force me to leave work and go home and sleep. That's the only thing I could do, was just sleep. Gut issues, depression issues, right? Didn't want to get out of bed in the morning, just feeling depressed. Life sucks. So I was going to multiple different doctors for multiple different problems, taking all these different pills. getting scans. I had a couple MRIs trying to understand what's going on in my head. Why did I feel so bad all the time? Nothing was found. So I was given painkillers and reactionary type protocols. And so I eventually started, like anybody else does, that gets lost in this healthcare system and not wanting to continue just treating with pills. I discovered functional medicine. And I started learning through functional medicine practitioners that you can ask the question, why am I sick? Not what do I have? And I was asking that question because prior to this, I didn't have these kinds of problems. They just all hit me at one time. So I started to learn from these guys. I was 38 years old at the time. And I did some testing for biological age, which was looking at like elasticity, methylation marker, certain things. And I was 43 biologically. So I was 5 years older than my chronological age. I then discovered genetically that there were certain things missing. I had certain detox genes that were completely missing, neurochemicals were off, etc. And the big sort of aha moment is that I was sitting there with no detox system, bad anti-inflammatory system, poor hardware throughout my body, in an office where a few floors down there was a manufacturing company pushing pollutant toxins into the airways that I was breathing day after day after day. And the answer to why I felt this way and my business partner didn't, he's the guy that used to drive me home feeling fine, is because the genetics of our detox pathways were completely opposite. Where I was missing copies, he had extra copies. He's a super potent detoxer. And so through learning all this stuff, I moved, right? I changed the way I worked, the way I ate. I started supplementing for my individual problems precisely what I needed. And I actually am 43, what I was meant to be at the time, and my biological age is 33. So I was able to reverse and like anti-age myself from the inside. If I had done it earlier, maybe I would have avoided some of this white hair and, slowed down some external aging too, which is hard to reverse. But internally, I've been able to pull things back. So this is, that was the moment where I literally handed the keys of the business to my partner and said, I found something that I have to work on. This is my mission. This is the thing that I have to give back to the world. I've spent enough time building things for me. And, I know how to go do that. I want to do this now. And so we did that. And we funded the research, that 7,000 person study. We built all the algorithms. And the other key big thing, having gone through all this, is I realized that somebody from the outside had to come in and make it easy to use. That was the big problem. One big problem was interpretation. It was a bunch of data that was dumb that only a scientist could understand. And second thing is it was too difficult to use. It wasn't a consumer friendly tool. And so that's what we built. When you go into our portal, it doesn't say a bunch of genes and what they mean, although that's there, you can learn it. It's like anxiety, procrastination, fat metabolization, the things that you actually understand. And right in there, recommendations. You're not doing so well here, so you might want to adopt these habits and lose these habits and take this supplement and eat this food because that's going to help you with this particular problem if that's what you're here to solve. And that's the way I needed the information presented. So I built it in the way I needed it, and now it works for people. So that's kind of the journey I went through. And now, I don't think I'm going to rest until we have an entirely new healthcare system operating out of this broken one, where people have a choice to be proactive and healthy as opposed to reacting to illness.
Earlier, when you were talking about different functional genes, you mentioned there was 100 different ones that you're testing right now. Do you feel like you guys are just at the tip of the iceberg right now with those 100 genes? Or do you feel like you're just going to, continue to test those and go deeper on what you can do within that realm?
Yeah, there's a little bit more to add, not a lot. So the main systems of the body and the main things that drive disease are already known. Inflammation and fibrosis, these are key factors that lead to disease. We already know what gets us there. The only things that may happen is, for example, in our mood and behavior or neurochemical panel, we still need to add oxytocin. We still need to add endorphins. So we're learning and adding which are the right functional genes that we can actually do stuff about. We're not relying on genetics per se, because genetics are looking for a switch to turn on and off. That's not the way the body works. You can't turn off one switch thinking you solved the problem because the body is more functional than that. So we are now working on another layer of research to add more, but there isn't going to be much more than that when it comes to functional interpretation. When it comes to genetics, they're going to keep, there's 22,000 genes to learn about. We don't know much about most of them, but most of them don't speak to chronic disease, aging, performance, sleep, recovery, the big things we deal with every day. That's pretty much mapped out in hormones, detoxification, diet, neurochemicals in the brain, uh, major chronic disease markers. We've got it mostly there. So there's a little bit more work to do. Then within that, it's just making these sort of algorithm or insights better so we can get more from the same, right? Ask us a question. Ask us, oh, how do I deal with female hair loss in my teenage years? Okay, we'll go figure that out. Ask me a question about why is it that, men from Thailand tend to get migraines in the winter? We'll go figure that out. So now from the same set of genes that are functional, that drive all core systems, we can solve pretty much any problem.
When you're going over your personal health history there, you mentioned you're either a non-detoxer or you're at least low in that realm. I'm curious, what are some things that you did being in that boat to help with detox? As
Yeah.
somebody who, you were already in your late 30s, you probably accumulated a lot of stuff in your body.
Yeah.
How did you go about cleaning shop and getting back to baseline?
So it's the same two dials I talked about. So one is I don't do the job well. Let's get rid of the problem. So I moved. I literally moved out of my office. Things like golf that you would not think are problematic, but you're walking around for 4 hours breathing in toxic pesticides that make that golf course look so beautiful. So I had to think about things like that. I had to think about having an organic mattress, which I do, right? You're sleeping on that thing for 8 hours. If you have something like memory foam, for example, and every time you roll around, you're popping little air bubbles and off gassing and breathing in toxins that maybe your body doesn't clear. I had to think about what cleaning chemicals are used in the home. Food is a big one. It's not just ingredients, it's processing chemicals. So there's things that just aren't labeled because they aren't part of the food themselves. They're part of what it takes to make it and put it together. And I'll give you a simple example. When you talk about a natural flavor is considered natural because it comes from a plant or an animal, so seemingly not a threat. But in order to take that thing, that initial source, and get it into the food in the state that it needs to be in, it's 50 to 100 chemicals, right? So there's a drink that I used to drink. It's a stevia based, clean. I thought I wasn't doing anything wrong, but the natural flavor in it kept giving me a migraine because of the number of chemicals that are not listed anywhere as ingredients. So it's learning about all these threats that we don't think about. So eliminating the threats. And then I started to supplement. So I went through a heavy detox and, NAC, selenium, alpha lipoic acid, milk thistle. I didn't jump to glutathione. A lot of people think, okay, your detox pathways are off, glutathione pathways are off, go take some glutathione. Well, guess what? If you don't have the best genetic instruction telling glutathione and your glutathione pathways what to do, your body can't use it properly. And you start to bind onto minerals and nutrients that you actually need because it's confused. And then you feel worse. And we actually deal with patients that come out of naturopath clinics that have taken a glutathione drip, like an IV, that become bedridden because they're also clearing all the minerals and everything their body needs to function. So I can now take glutathione because I've done the heavy lifting to get my body to a certain point. It's kind of like going to the gym. You got to train to get your body ready. It's not every supplement is designed for everybody. And that's what I did. So it's heavy supplementation, heavy cleansing, heavy detox, going through a 1 week cleanse to allow my body to clear itself of all the junk and allowing my liver a chance to breathe, and then maintaining after that. So since then, I haven't had these problems.
How do you feel about intermittent fasting? Is this something you do personally? And when you're working with people, it's become such a hot topic in the health
Yeah.
and wellness space, something that comes up on the show all the time. Genetically, is there certain things that people want to look for when it comes to being a better candidate for being somebody that's into longer fasts or intermittent fasting?
I would say in general, for men, it's a much easier answer. Go ahead and do it. For men, it signals growth hormone. It signals all positive, beneficial reactions in the body that keep you younger. Metabolic processes are the single biggest job we do that age us the most. the biggest usage of energy, the biggest aging job, which is eating. So the more you eat, the faster you're going to age. For women, we're very careful to look at the hormone pathways and personalize, because some women are more estrogen dominant. No, so think back again. If you think about your ancestors and who they truly were, starvation for a man signals it's time for battle. It's time to go out there and fight, right? That when you struggle, because that struggle didn't happen often. If it wasn't battle time, you lived on a farm, you lived in a village, and it was just family, and there wasn't a lot going on. Starvation for women signals I need to take care of the kids potentially for months. The family could be gone for months at battle, right? Which causes to fat, like leads to fat retention. So there's some women that are more estrogen dominant where we tell them twice a week max. You don't want to signal starvation. You want to signal cleansing and fasting. For men, every day. The only thing I would say is that as we age, the one meal a day becomes a little extreme. So go ahead and start, but bring it back down to like a, 8 to 12 hour eating window, you know, um, and that's the one key thing that I would say that we've been learning, that people that stick to like that one meal a day over time, that becomes problematic. Not enough muscle mass, which then is problematic for insulin response. Your muscles are very important for regulating sugar levels and insulin response. Neurochemical hormones, everything starts to get out of whack. So that's our general thing. Men, every day, great. Uh, if you're going to go with a really small window, open it up after a few months to maintain. Women, if you're more estrogen dominant, we can understand that genetically, or you can just look at your body type. Are you more curvy, harder to burn fat? You're probably more estrogen dominant. Then you might want to do a little less per week.
For somebody that's tuned into this point, they might start to be thinking, okay, I'm doing all these good things that I've learned on this show and from, books and different areas of media they've taken in. They might be starting to wonder about some of the practices that they've adopted over time. And, we've talked about exercise and diet and supplements, and how if you're not doing that in line with your genetics, you could be, not optimally tuning your body up. So what I'm getting at here is, are there certain things that you recommend to the average person? Because our whole thesis to this point has been, the shoe is different for each person. It's not one size fits all. But are there certain core things when it comes to these different pillars of health that we can all do if we don't have the means to get genetic testing done, or if we're in the process of getting it done and we want to continue living healthfully?
Yeah, so there definitely are. Sleep, you'll hear everywhere, is huge. What's happening in your sleep? There's two things. In the first half of your sleep, you're recovering from the day before. So everything that you expose yourself to needs to be cleaned up, and that's done in the first half. And in the second half, you're getting ready for the next day. So all your hormone production, neurochemical production is all done in that second half of sleep. So, and there's a lot we can speak to. We can do a whole other conversation just on sleep and the genetics of what drives different sleep problems. But focusing on that and getting it better. And the one easy thing to do is just structure your schedule and remove irritants, temperature problems, noise problems, light leakage problems, which cause a problem in the second half of the night. So that's a big one. The second big, and probably the number one problem causing a lot of issues that we are completely oblivious to, is environmental health. We touched on that several times in this talk, which is we are not wired for our current reality. Because it is so prolific and it's everywhere and everybody's doing it, we think it's normal. Every kid goes to school with a plastic something. Everybody sprays certain chemicals. So well, everybody does it. Why is it such a problem for me? Nobody's supposed to do it. None of us are designed for it, right? Which is why so many people are so sick. Why is autoimmunity going through the roof? Why are all these problems? These aren't new people. We're the same people genetically. These are new problems. So something else changed, not the people, right? The environment changed. Just awareness of that and understanding every choice you make to buy something, use something, spray something, eat something, breathe something is a choice between health and illness. It's a major, major, major threat. The third, I would say, is we know that disease is rooted in inflammation. We don't ask so often what inflammation is rooted in. And so just understanding and being proactive about measuring, like going, not waiting. Blood work and measuring shouldn't be about reacting to illness. It's a little late at that point, and then you're going to be stuck in that bucket of reacting to illness. Be proactive and know what things you can measure that signal that there may be a problem. Certain inflammatory markers, certain proteins, certain oxidative stress markers that can signal you're not making the right choices right now, and you're actually choosing to age faster, and you're choosing to ride a path of disease, and then you can veer the course and make the right choices and avoid all those problems. So those are the three big ones that if you do those things, you can avoid a lot of headache.
Earlier, we were talking about vitamin D. I want to make sure we hash that out fully and people understand the three different genes that are required for fully optimizing vitamin D in the body. And I think yourself, you have either one or two quote unquote errors with your genes.
Right.
So you talked about taking higher doses and splitting up that dose.
Yeah.
Let's go into the nuance of that a little bit more. For somebody who needs to optimize that pathway or another supplement pathway, are those kind of the two means that we have of doing that, giving a higher dose and then spacing it out throughout the day?
Yeah, giving even the correct dose, meaning that there's some people, for example, hormonally, that need a little bit less, right? And then there's some women where they take hormone supplements and they start to get headaches and they don't feel well because the dose is too much for them. Then there's a question of what version. When we're looking at methylation, and when a woman gets pregnant, the first thing that happens is, here's your folic acid. Well, what if their SHMT1 gene is off and they actually need folinic acid? They need a different version. So the version of what you're taking becomes important for some micronutrients. Then the dose and how much and how often, right? So for some women, they don't need their hormone supplement every single day. They only need it potentially in the luteal or like earlier phase of the cycle when estrogens are spiking high, right? So they don't, and then depending on what the genetics of their hormone map looks like, or splitting the dose, for example, like with vitamin D. There's some people that, because you transport it so slow, because you bind it so inefficiently, whatever I give you, you're only using a certain fraction of. So I need to give it to you twice or sometimes three times for certain people, right? So, and I'm one of those people where I do take it twice. I find it's such an important micronutrient that it's something you have to do for life daily. There isn't enough, right? Especially if you live like we live in the north and there's clouds in winter. If I go move to Jamaica, maybe it's a different story, right? So, but for now, I have to take it daily.
And vitamin D aside, we know that's part of your core list for everybody. But are there any others for people that don't have their genetic results at this point that you recommend taking on a regular basis, supplement wise?
Oh, sure. I mean, everybody needs magnesium. Everybody's short and low. I definitely feel the difference when I take it and when I don't, especially in my sleep. Zinc is a big thing that's overlooked. Very important, and we're finding the more people we look at, the more people that have illness have bad zinc genetics, so they don't metabolize it, and they need a much higher dose. So usually when you buy a zinc supplement, it tells you to take 5 milligram a day. That's sort of the standard. We're finding that there's some people that need 10 or 15 depending on their genetics, and we're talking about like cancer prevention, like not small problems, right? Zinc is a very potent micronutrient that supports a lot of pathways. That's another big one. So find out how you're doing there. You likely need more. Um, Vitamin C, we sort of devalue what it actually does, and we think of it as like cold and flu season, antiviral. It's actually a potent antioxidant. So it supports, the reduction of aging, cellular health, cellular resiliency. And so updosing that, especially if you feel like you're getting sick or it's wintertime, so last week when I was sick, I was taking 20,000 IU of vitamin D. I was taking 3 to 5,000 milligram of vitamin C, depending, the beginning I was taking more and then I slowed it down. I was taking zinc. I was taking an echinacea extract that was really potent viral killer, and I was taking quercetin, and I got over what I think was a pretty nefarious virus, if we want to call it that, in 4 days. Like, I was one day couldn't get out of bed, and by the second day I was working. And by the third and fourth day I was kind of back at it.
There's a lot of talk in the health and wellness space about longevity.
Yeah.
And I'm curious from a genetic standpoint. So if you're looking at somebody's genetic testing, is there a handful of genes you're looking at when you're trying to predict how long that person, obviously the lifestyle is a huge part of that, but genetically how long that person, what their core baseline is for longevity?
Yes, there's one major gene we look at, which is in our longevity report. And this is one of the few genes that we look at as a standalone genetic call as opposed to a functional pathway or system because of the way it works. So the FOXO3 gene is called, FOXO3. Um, so we're familiar with this process of like cells mutate and die and this cellular degradation and senescent cells. And we need to get rid of all that stuff and allow for the body to create new healthy cells. So the people that have this certain allele or version of the FOXO3 gene are hyper efficient at this process of getting rid of dying, mutating, and aging cells and replacing them with healthy cells. And so they're kind of staying ahead of that aging process. And we have a couple people, for example, there's an MD that works with us who's in his 60s that you could not think is beyond 40. Right? When you look at him, he hasn't done anything special, normal MD. He didn't have functional knowledge, so he just did the normal stuff. But you could never tell that he was his age. So that's a big one for just understanding how your body deals with longevity. Then it's taking all of what we talked about. So the longevity report looks at all the other core systems we look at, which are diet, brain, mood, hormones, immunity and cellular health. And what am I missing here? Sleep. And I'm missing one big thing. I can't remember what I'm missing. But anyway, it takes all of what we're looking at and reinterprets that data for the context of longevity. So we look at brain, Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline in general, brain function. We look at body, so bone, skin, hair, wrinkles, cellulite, right? All of these processes that will lead to bad results there. We look at what we call biodefense. So your body's ability to slow its aging processes down because of how well it deals with defending itself from the environment and nutrition threats. We look at insulin response and insulin resistance and how that can lead to a certain number of problems. And so all of the same data is reinterpreted for the context of how do you live an extra 15, 20 years, but we're talking about health span, not lifespan, like riding your bike, playing with your grandchildren, not in a hospital bed, like quality years, taking that vitality, energy, youthfulness of your 30s and putting that into your 90s. How do you do that? And that's what that last report is about.
Got it. And earlier you talked about how your team's likely going to find, a couple more different genes that they'll be testing over time. But as a whole, you guys are pretty comprehensive where you're at already. But what I'm curious about is genetics as a whole, this field in general, beyond what you guys are doing. Where do you see all this going in the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, the next big thing is gene editing, right? So there's companies like us that are identifying targets, let's call it. So we're interpreting what the body's doing to understand what are the main jobs we need to fix. So for example, the way we think about cholesterolemia is that cholesterolemia isn't the disease. Endothelium inflammation is the disease. That's a precursor to cholesterolemia. So if we treat that, then cholesterolemia doesn't need to happen. So when we finally figure out how to adopt gene therapy head to toe, which we're basically there now, then we can work on people that have the bad quality hardware, edit their genome to give them the good quality hardware. And then their susceptibility to cholesterolemia and heart disease falls off a cliff all of a sudden. This is where you see, grandma smoking when she's 95 years old saying, here's my longevity secret. It's this pack of cigarettes a day, right? Because she probably had the robust endothelium that just couldn't get inflamed. So how do we take that and give it to other people? So that's where I see things going is the technology of gene editing and CRISPR and all these things is progressing. The interpretation and knowledge base of what do we actually focus on that moves the needle and helps people is getting really, really good. And those will converge and we're going to create products that allow people to truly prevent disease or edit their genome to not have to worry about that risk.
And to your knowledge, at this point, has there been anybody, a human being, that's had any of their genetic material edited out and another piece put in?
Yeah. The only human approved product from the FDA was actually for the eye. It was an eye condition. I don't know what the condition was, but there was some eye condition where. So the challenge is, how do you get this to adopt head to toe? There's 50 trillion cells in your body that all have to instantaneously adopt the same change. So a gene edit it's not take one cell and literally splice and edit it. Every cell has to have the same code. So that's the challenge right now. So they've been able to do it localized. So they actually treated successfully this eye condition. I don't know what it is, but FDA approved. It was done. It's now a viable treatment. So the question becomes, how do you adopt it head to toe so that not just, because keep in mind, different cells in your body read certain parts of the genome to become who they are. So a heart cell only reads the heart section of the DNA book to do the heart jobs. That's why it looks the way it looks. There's very few cells that actually read the entire book. So it's much easier to work on something localized, right? Versus every type of cell has to adopt that change. That's where things become tricky, but I think we're going to get there.
It's fascinating and scary at the same time.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, there's a question about, do I resolve myself, or is it beyond germline? Is this something that becomes a permanent change to my genome that people that inherit? That's a moral and ethical question, right? Am I truly altering this human being, or am I just treating the condition? So I think in terms of treating, we're not crossing any lines. It's just like masking a symptom. You're treating a genetic failure. Once you get into inherited genetic alteration, that's when you get into like a line of like, well, how far can this go? Are we changing humanity? And that's kind of like the sort of line in the sand for me.
And then even if we get that to work, once two people that have had that done reproduce, how robust are their kids and generations after that?
Yeah, exactly. Now all of a sudden there's people walking around thinking they're invincible, right? And so what do you end up doing to the environment? And what are you worried about? And if chemicals aren't a threat anymore, you're going to use a lot more chemicals. That's just human nature. We're lazy and we do things that are easy, right? So there's the social outcome of, if we make ourselves all into superhumans, how do we then change our decisions every day? And we know the way we think, we're probably going to go in the wrong direction there. So there's some level of like, let's stick to our roots and understand what's actually a threat for not just us, but the plants and animals and environment around us, right?
And I realized my opinion may differ from somebody that has a genetic defect that they were born with, or somebody that has a family member that has something like that, versus somebody like me who's healthy and has a healthy family,
Yeah.
where it's like, okay, I don't want to mess with that, but there's these people that are suffering. And I understand there's this continuum, and it's a very nuanced conversation that's going to take time
Yeah.
to fully unravel.
And so what you just said there is a key differentiator, that the delineating line of, do I actually have a genetic condition? And by the way, none of what we were talking about today has to do with genetic conditions. Everything we were talking about today has to do with things you adopt: chronic disease, aging, performance issues. You weren't born with any of this stuff. But there are rare genetic conditions. It's a tiny sliver of healthcare, but they're big problems. They're small, meaning that they don't affect many people, but they're big, meaning that their whole life and their identity is about that problem. So that's where genetic therapeutics will be very, very powerful to turn those switches on or off. That's genetics, right? And it's very clear that that person needs that therapeutic. They don't have any other option. What we've been talking about today is everything else, which is the majority of the healthcare budget, which is chronic disease and aging issues, which should never happen to begin with. So let's plug those holes and gaps. So that two different conversations.
So for people who have tuned into this point and they're interested in having their genes tested, you're offering my listeners and viewers a discount of $80 off the testing. So we're going to link that up in the show notes. And talk about somebody who does decide to make that investment, what they're going to get.
Sure. So going back to what I was saying about making it easy. So we don't believe it's a test. A test is, here's your results. We don't think that's enough. It needs to be interpreted. So you get the results. Here's your different versions of the different genes we look at. But more importantly, you're logging into a portal. It's digital in nature, so we can keep updating and you keep learning as time goes on. And there's 6 big areas: mood and behavior, the brain, diet, nutrition, how do you deal with macros and micros, sleep, immunity and the health of the cell, innate cellular health, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, and all the big chronic disease issues, and then hormones. So body type, body development, fat, skin, hair, all the female hormone issues. And then the last piece is longevity. So all of these six get reinterpreted in the context of longevity. So you drill into these things and you'll see things like anxiety, depression, you'll see bone health, you'll see Alzheimer's, you'll see metabolizing fats and carbs, and you'll be able to very easily read this stuff. And in the same micro reports within each section, recommendations. Consider adopting this habit, consider removing this habit, consider taking this supplement for that problem. So that's what you get. But in addition to that, we know there's some people that want to sort of geek out and learn more about the genes themselves. So we built what we call a gene cast, which is a personalized podcast for each person. So you get the genes reports in the way that I said, speaking to the problems with recommendations. But then you get access to these audio files that our AI system will pull your personalized result and give to you DRD2 gene. This gene regulates the density of the receptors for your experience with dopamine, and that may cause you to experience reward at different levels. You have the GG version, which means less density, which means you're more reward seeking, which means you're a better entrepreneur, which means you're more open to risk, and it will tell you about each gene. So there's this sort of podcast that you get, right? And to pull it all together, there's a video in each section that tells you how to think about that problem. So when it comes to cardiovascular disease, don't think about it as a heart disease. You need to think about it as an endothelial inflammation disease. So we reframe for you the root cause of that problem, and we teach that through video. So that's all of what someone gets. If somebody wants support, we have functional genomic practitioners that can help you. You know, you can get coaching or whatever you need. Like, suppose there's an actual problem, like I just can't lose these last 10 pounds. Tell me through my DNA why I'm stuck. You know, I've tried everything. Well, there's probably a hormone reason or a detox reason or something else. We can help with that. So that's what it kind of looks like. The intention is go through the reports, and if you follow what it says, you'll be able to self-navigate and deal with your problems. If you want guidance and coaching, we have that also available, fully trained functional genomics practitioners that can help.
And we talked about early in the conversation, one of the cool things about this is that your genes don't change. So when you get this testing done, you have this framework, this roadmap that you're going to have for life. And I assume, and you can clarify this, for somebody that has this done, as you guys continue to, you know, uncover new genes and new information on the genes that you're already testing, is that going to be provided to people that have had the testing done?
Yeah, so that this is why we made the portal digital very purposefully, so that we can keep improving it and improving it and improving it, and you keep learning more. So the beauty is, yes, your DNA doesn't change. We keep learning. We're never going to stop learning. So we keep uploading and updating the algorithm and the AI, so that, you know, I would say once, sometimes twice a year, there's a major update, and you can go back and learn more. There may even be additional genes. The only time where you may need to be retested, if there's a new gene that we didn't test for that we think is important, we may let you know there's additional. But at that point, it's not a full test. It's just taking the same DNA and just resequencing it for that gene. So it's a much smaller investment.
And the cool thing too is that you're just spitting into a tube. Testing is harmless.
Yeah, it's literally spitting into a tube. It goes to our lab. We extract the DNA from the saliva. We sequence it. It goes into our algorithm where we then understand how to populate your portal the way we describe, and then you self-navigate and learn. And it's a lot of information, by the way. You can spend a lot of time diving into this thing. Prepare yourself for like no Netflix for a month, you know.
And there is a certain vulnerability to having your genes tested, especially as this is just unraveling to, you know, the world as a whole, and it's a relatively new thing. And what I'm getting at here is confidentiality. If people are worried about, you know, this is my most vulnerable makeup and it's in the hands of this company, or, you know, there's different companies that are doing different forms of testing, but you can only speak to your company. Talk about confidentiality if somebody is worried about that.
Sure. Well, that's a real problem, firstly. Like the genetic, I would assume if you're getting a genetic test, and I'm not going to put us in this bucket, I'll explain why, but I would assume if you're buying a genetic test, your data is being sold, mined, licensed to somebody. And the challenge is exactly what we said, that your DNA never changes. So as a genetic testing company, you sold a test and then what? Right? Where's the reoccurring business for that company. And then a lot of genetic companies got stuck here saying, well, what do we do? So they all became data selling businesses. And now the big problem there is if you're a data selling business and the pharma customer is paying you $5,000 per data set and the front end customer is paying a few hundred for the test, well, who's the real customer? Who do you prioritize? And what information do you actually want to offer? And so all these tests have become mass data dump tests. Like, I'm going to test your entire genome and tell you everything. Yeah, it's a stack of paper like this that doesn't do much for me. It's only that first 2 pages that I needed to read, right? And so they become these data dump tests that are designed for the data buyer who wants it all. And you get underwhelmed. And you have all these doctors that say, I don't use genetic testing because it doesn't push anything. It doesn't inform, unless somebody has a rare cancer or something. I can't use it for anything. So we decided to be that company where if we very purposely do what you wanted, which is, here's my DNA, go mine it and tell me everything I need to know, right? That should be the job that we do. So we became this insight business, and we don't sell data. It's right in our terms. It's all anonymized, aggregated. If somebody knocked on our door saying we need access to this, it doesn't exist. So long story short, we became this company that mines data ourselves internally to build insights to then help people with autism, with Crohn's, with migraines, with skin issues, as opposed to selling that data to a pharma company to go build that eczema product or that Crohn's product or that migraine product. And so we feel we'll end up partnering, and we've already started doing this, by the way, with industry leaders to go build the solutions without having to sell anyone's data, as opposed to going and selling the data so that someone can go build something. That's the road we took.
Really important. All right. Well, I really appreciate the work you're doing in the world. This conversation was great. And I think you have a book coming out. Is that within the next year?
Yeah, it's in May. So it was interesting. We made it. So one of our customers was actually the CEO of a publishing company, and he went through our program, and we ended up working on. So anyways, we made a deal to put this book together, and we feel this is really important because it's going to somewhat normalize the concept of this needs to be part of your toolkit. And we need people to learn. It's not just, I have a rare cancer, or what's my ancestry, I'm 5% Nigerian. There's a lot more to be learned from your DNA than that for all the big problems we deal with. And we feel that the book, even as a first step, will help people understand what's possible. It's called The DNA Way. It's already, I think, for pre-sale on Amazon, but it launches in May of this year.
Amazing. Well, congrats on that. I know undertaking a book, I haven't written one, but from what I hear is a big thing. And
yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
Congrats on that and all your other accomplishments. Really enjoyed the conversation again, and thank you.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure.
You're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Kara, where you're going to learn how to reduce your biological age. There's a lot more to learn. I'll see you over there.
We were able to change gene expression towards something more youthful. So our participants actually got over 3 years younger, building our intervention brick by brick.